much for joining us today. We're going to get kicked off in just about a minute, give people some time to get on. Super delighted to have you with us. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. We're going to start very shortly. We've got a great number of people coming on. Super. Well, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kathy Roth-Duquet. I'm the CEO and the board chair of board president of Blue Star Families. Thank you so much for joining us here today for the Blue Star Families Applied Research Team as they explore the data and findings of our 2022 Military Family Lifestyle Survey. This work is always stronger with the necessary collaboration of the Daniello Institute for Veterans and Military Families at Syracuse University. We're really thrilled that our friends at IVMF are here today to help us review the data and answer your questions. So before we go any further, I'd like to thank everyone in the audience who attended yesterday's event. It was so meaningful to have all of you join us to celebrate this report, to hear the stories, to hear from our stakeholders in the government and in think tanks across the field to help us understand the data. If you were not able to attend, no worries. The recording is available on our website, and our chat moderator will drop a link in the chat right now. Today, we continue yesterday's exploration of the areas where we can improve lives of military and veteran-connected families. I'd like to welcome the Blue Star Families Applied Research Team to set the stage for the next hour. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to diving into the data with you. Team?
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Kathy, for that lovely introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you are here to join us today. The purpose of this deep dive is to provide some additional data around each topic. We got to do a little bit of an overview yesterday, but now we get to dive a little bit more into the data and discuss it and learn what people are interested in and develop more insights around it. So the research team has selected a handful of data points to spark the discussion amongst our panelists during yesterday's panel titled Addressing the Recruitment Crisis, but there's so much more to share. So in this data deep dive, we have three goals. One, present some additional data that's relevant to the discussion from the previous session. Two, answer questions about the data or the findings. And three, provide an opportunity for discussion, because the beauty of an annual military family lifestyle survey is we've got another one coming around. So we want to know what you're interested in and what other things we want to explore. So because this is a live session though, the research team, this amazing research team that we have, will do their best to answer questions, but some questions are either going to require some more digging or we may not be able to provide an immediate answer. So if we cannot provide a response in this session, trust we are taking notes and we will be able to send a response, and we may be able to send a response in a follow-up email. Often, one thing to note is that we're not able to answer all the questions. The data may not allow it. Often when we drill down to very specific groups, the sample sizes are too small to responsibly report. The questions that you ask, though, can provide us some direction for our future survey iterations. And inevitably, answers to research questions provoke more research questions. So the annual survey allows us to continue exploring and continue pulling the thread and digging deeper. So on that note, I'd like to share that our Blue Star Families next survey launches on May 24th, and we'll hope you will help us to share it broadly so we can continue doing this work. Now I want to go over a few ground rules for this session. One, to ask a question, please type it out in the chat. We have several team members who are standing by who can respond to questions in the chat or direct them to the attention of the facilitator, where I can answer questions later. We are also recording questions and we'll send that follow-up email with questions and responses for the ones that we can. Two, please be respectful and considerate when you are framing your question. And we, of course, will remove any vulgar or inappropriate or inconsiderate participants. So just keep that in mind. Also, this is being recorded. We know that these stats that we're sharing, the findings that we're sharing, they're not just data points. They reflect real people's lives. They can evoke stories and memories of personal experiences. And we welcome your experiences. If you'd like to share your story, we can connect you with our storytelling team. Finally, as you probably noticed, as I mentioned just briefly a moment ago, we are providing another friendly reminder that this recording is, or this session is being recorded. So thank you all for joining us. I'd like to pass it over to our Associate Director of Research, Roger Brooks, to give us an overview of the findings. Roger, over to you for the data.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you all for being here today. We're really excited. We're going to dive a little bit deeper in some of the data points that you heard discussed yesterday. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. Okay. Today, we're going to be diving a little bit deeper in the variables that we looked at when it comes to the recruitment challenges that are currently being faced. Some overarching themes that we came across were good benefits, economic stability were top reasons for respondents in recommending services, while challenges with family and poor military leadership were identified as top reasons for not recommending service. So looking at that a little bit deeper, poor military leadership, challenges for families, and financial sacrifice were cited by respondents as top reasons why they were unlikely to recommend military service. While the largest group of active duty family respondents were likely to recommend military service, 37%, about a quarter of those participants were unlikely to recommend, and leaving about a third, they were just neutral when it came to recommending services. When we dive a little bit deeper and look at kind of the gender differences that we found among respondents, we found that females who would recommend service identified good benefits, positive opportunities, and job acquisitions as top reasons. Females who endorsed not recommending service identified challenges on families, poor leadership, and racial and gender discrimination as top reasons why they would not recommend service. Additionally, female veterans identified sexual assault, mental health, concerns, and lack of quality in service for VA benefits as top reasons why they would not recommend service. And when we looked at their male counterparts, male respondents who were unlikely to recommend service identified lack of leadership, politics, and general need for improvement as the reasons why they would not recommend service. Those who were more likely to recommend service mentioned reasons similar to their female counterparts, such as good benefits and economic and job stability. Personal development, good benefits, job skills were top reasons cited by both males and female veterans who were likely to recommend service. Active duty family respondents continue to pay well over expected cost share to secure housing, though satisfaction with their housing situation declined for those who had relocated recently. So we see that here in the slide, we see 55% of active duty families would prefer to, or respondents would prefer to live in civilian housing, and 17% of those were actually living in military housing. When we look at relocation, a greater percentage of respondents who relocated in the last year resided in military housing, and a lower proportion reported owning civilian housing. Respondents who had relocated within the past year reported lower levels of satisfaction compared to their counterparts who did not recently relocate. When we looked at food insecurity, we found some interesting comorbid or cumulative impact here. While 10% of civilian families in the United States experienced food insecurities in 2021, 60% of our respondents reported experiencing low to very low food security levels in 12 months preceding our survey. This data is well below the DoD estimated 26% of service members and 25% of spouses who reported experiencing food insecurities. Food insecurities occur, so one thing we do know is that food insecurities occur across all ranks. Proportionally though, more enlisted families reported experiencing low to very low food insecurity. 1/4 of enlisted active duty family respondents reported experiencing some level of food insecurity, in contrast to 4% of their officer counterparts. So continue to dive down into the food insecurities. Nearly 1 in 5 recently relocated respondent experienced some level of food insecurity during that 12-month period, in contrast to 15% of their counterparts that had not recently relocated. 21% of those active duty family respondents who indicated that underemployment or unemployed is a top concern factor for their financial stress also reported low to very low food insecurities. 16% of respondents who said relocation costs contributed to their financial stress reported low to very low food security. And 4 in 5 active duty family respondents who reported low or very low food security would not recommend military service to a younger family member, having a potential impact on the future generation of military service members. Compared to the civilian counterparts, so when we look at spouse employment compared to their civilian counterparts, respondents are still reporting lower levels of participating in the labor force, so 65 versus 72%, and experience unemployment 3 to 4 times greater, so that's 21 versus 6%. When we look at that unemployment disparity, it's even greater for active duty spouses of color. When we took a look at the flexibility of work, now that we're in this world where virtual work is kind of the standard, approximately 1 in 10 active duty spouse respondents who are working either full-time or part-time reported experiencing low food security in the past 12 months compared to 1 in 4 active duty spouses respondents who are not currently working but do want or need to work. 2/3 of the spouse respondents who had been employed prior to their most recent relocation reported that they were not able to maintain their employment through that relocation. And now I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Harvey, one of our partners at the Anello Institute for Veteran and Military Family at Syracuse University, for some more information about veteran financial wellness.
Hello, everyone. This year, we spent some time exploring aspects of veteran financial wellness through our 2022 MFLS data. We looked at 2 aspects of financial wellness in 2 groups. We have working age veterans, which constitutes respondents from ages 21 to 64, and aging veterans, which are those 65 years old and plus. And as we can see on the slide, do we have the slide?
We do. Let me
Okay.
share it again.
Thank you, Roger. As we can see on the slide, and this is from our MFLS report, in terms of overall financial wellness, most veteran respondents have said that their family was doing okay financially or living comfortably. But housing costs, major home repairs, excessive credit card debts were primary financial stressors. Additionally, while most of all veteran respondents reported their family is doing okay, living comfortably, other reports have shown mixed results on financial issues related to medical cost and financial inequity for veterans. And furthermore, this financial wellness differs between working age veterans and veteran respondents. A smaller proportion of aging veteran respondents report financial stress when compared to their working age counterparts. Of all the veterans who reported experiencing financial stress due to medical cost, we have dental care, prescription drug costs, and specialty care copays that were identified as the top 3 contributing medical costs to their financial stress. And that information you can see in a table in our MFLS report. So overall, we see that medical costs have played a significant role in the financial concerns of many of our veterans. As the veteran population in the US grows older, there remains a very important need to further understand how insurances are used by veterans and how that impacts the types of financial stress that we may have for our veteran population. If you're interested in more information about veteran financial wellness, please visit the full MFLS report for more detail. And with that, this concludes the presentation portion of this deep dive. Now over to Jess to start the question and discussion portions.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, Dr. Harvey, and Roger. Thank you so much for presenting those slides for us. We will also share out the slides in the follow-up email, as well as we can share links to the full report and the executive summary and the comprehensive infographic as well. So let's get into some of the questions. Let me see what questions we have in the chat. I think I saw one for what was that the only reason for not recommending service to young people? So let me start with that one. Definitely not the only one. We got on that question. So we asked the question, 2 questions in this year's survey. One was on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend military service to a young person, a young family member? So it's important to note that there's no gender to that. We didn't ask whether it was recommending to a young woman or a young man, or your young cousin, your child themselves, just a young family member. And the reason we ask that is because we know how important it is for to look at the currently serving population, because most of our currently serving military service members are members of families that have a tradition of military service. So we know that they pass that tradition of service down, and as the number of families who have had military service gets smaller and smaller and smaller, that's a smaller pool to come to draw from. So we know it's important to look at the currently serving and see whether they're recommending service to their young family members to continue that tradition of military service. So we asked that 0 to 10 question, and those who responded 0 to 3, those were categorized as unlikely to recommend service. Those who said 7 to 10 were categorized as likely to recommend service, because 10 was would definitely recommend or something along those lines, and 0 was not at all likely to recommend. And then there was, of course, a group that landed in the middle. So you might have heard me say yesterday that the greatest proportion of active duty family respondents were likely to recommend service. So they were in that 7 to 10 group. That's about 37%. But there was about a quarter who were unlikely to recommend. So the second part of it is we asked an open-ended question that said, just essentially, why or why not? Why would you recommend service, or why would you not recommend military service? Why did you give this answer that you gave? And we got over 5,000 open-ended responses there. So people wrote paragraphs of why the things that made them more likely to recommend or less likely to recommend. And we took all of those responses and coded them using a qualitative coding analysis. We looked at a narrative analysis essentially, and pulled the most common themes and grouped them by subgroups. So those who were unlikely to recommend, they said these things. Those who were likely to recommend, they said these things. And then we could even look at it by subgroups. So female veterans who are unlikely to recommend service said things like sexual assault was one of the reasons that I wouldn't recommend service. And then male veterans said something else. I don't remember that one off the top of my head, but that's how we were able to look at those different reasons for recommending or against recommending. So certainly we were not limited to 1 or 2 things, 1 or 2 answer options for not recommending service. There were a lot of reasons that people noted. And some of the top reasons were things like challenges to families, which is something that as Blue Star families, we've known this for a long time. We've known military families are really, they want to serve, they have a desire to serve their country, but there are some things we can do to make it a little bit easier. So challenges for families was one, financial sacrifice was one, poor military leadership was another one. And there was a whole list of other things that, decreasing, that came up with decreasing frequency in those open-ended answers. So I hope that answered that question. Let's see what other questions we have. It looks like, okay, interesting to see comparison. Oh, thank you. I'm glad I answered that question. Specify, okay, I see a question in the chat that says, did they specify what challenges for families, deployments, relationships, etc.? Yes, all of the above. So when we coded these things, we break it down into lots of different codes. So it might be the impacts of deployment on family. We spent too much time apart. My service member does not have as much of a relationship with the kids as I would like him to have because they've been gone for so long. Or relocating frequently is challenging for our family because of spouse employment, because of children's education. So we have all of those things and we collapse them into just generally, these are all of the challenges that we're talking about: deployments, relationships, children's education, stressors on spouse employment, stress, financial challenges, childcare challenges, all of those things. So I hope that answered that question as well. I see the question on the total number of respondents. That is 9,363. I have that number memorized. Okay, one more question in the chat is looking at the stressors in next year's survey. Interesting. It would be interesting to see the comparisons between the answers of this survey to the new survey coming out in May. The insecurities faced by our military members and veterans will most likely show a big impact, especially for those stationed overseas, with the possibility of getting a decrease in COLA this year. We need to do better for our military members, families, and military communities. Yes, okay, so looking at every year, we want to look at stressors and challenges that military families are facing, right? So some of those things are perennial and they continue year over year. For example, military pay is one of the top issues this year. It was also a top issue last year. Time away from family is a top issue this year, was a top issue last year. So these are some of the things that we continue to see over time. And it is interesting to look at it year over year, but it is also important to remember that we use a convenience sample for our survey methodology. So that it's not necessarily the same group of people that is answering a survey year over year over year. So it's hard to do a trend analysis because the sample changes year over year. So one year we may have, this year we had a lot more older veteran respondents than we have in the past. So that makes it a little harder to do those comparisons. But it is interesting to track these top issues as they raise over time. But looking at particularly issue of potential for a decrease in COLA, I think it's also important to remember that the military compensation package is made up of a lot of different things. So not just base pay, but COLA, but BAH and BAS and any specialty pays and any separation pays and all of those different things lead into the total compensation package. So COLA is one area where it may increase or decrease, and BAH is the same thing. So we do need to continue to keep an eye on financial security and financial wellness of military families, and that's one of the things that Blue Star Families continues to do in this survey year over year. And we'll continue to look at and assess these things as we go over time. There's another question on what determines the questions being asked in each survey? That is a fantastic question, because obviously with an annual survey, some things we want to track some things over time, but we also want to look at those perennial issues that we see year over year, like spouse employment, like children's education, like time away, like military pay. Those are all things that we want to make sure that we keep track of, but there's only so much space in our survey. If y'all have taken a survey, you know it is comprehensive, which is my term for it's a little long and there's a lot of topics. And that's beautiful because we are able to look at things across and different topics and how they relate to one another. That's how we're able to see that families who are food insecure, who have a spouse who's unemployed, are also more likely to be food insecure. So we can look at those things in relationship to one another. So every year we assess what are the topics that we want to make sure that we cover this year, looking at what are the perennial topics, how do we want to cover them in a new way, how can we add more to the conversation, how can we advance policy, what is the data piece that is missing that will help us advance policy on this particular issue. So for example, spouse employment, we've been talking about since 2009. This has been an issue for a long time. How do we look at that in a new way that will provide some new information that will help us advance policy on this? So rather than just continuing to report that a certain number of spouses are unemployed and the unemployment rate has not changed significantly in years, what else can we do to help move this policy, advance this, and make this better for military families? So one of the ways that we determine the questions, look at what are these perennial issues and how can we assess them in a new way? And then we want to look at what are the emerging issues that we think are probably going to come up, but have not really talked about yet. So that could be like family building last year was a new issue that we hadn't talked about before, but we wanted to explore it and look at it in a new way. So we pulled some questions that are about perennial issues that we know are continuing to be problematic, and then we look at emerging issues. And sometimes we can alternate year over year because, for example, food insecurity is a great example of that. We asked about food insecurity in 2020. We didn't want to ask about it again in 2021 because we just asked about it and we weren't anticipating a significant change in the course of a year. But we asked about it again in 2022, so we can kind of see where things are and see there is a little bit of a difference from 2020 to 2022, keeping in mind that it's a different sample. So a lot of factors go into play. We create these questions not only in partnership with our friends at the Daniello Institute for Veterans and Military Families, but also in partnership with policymakers. We talk to people who are making these decisions and ask them what information would be helpful for you in making decisions about policies and programs that support military families. So a lot of thought goes into it, and we definitely iterate year over year on what questions we ask. So let me see what other questions we have in the chat. It looks like, do we ever review data by installation or region? And with that, are there trends or that can be found based on region as it pertains to spousal employment, food insecurity, et cetera? Another really good question. Thank you for that. So yes and no. Yes, and we are limited. That's the answer to that. When we look at regions, when we can break it down by region, and we have done that before, and we will continue to do that in the future, particularly thinking of our diverse experiences of military and veteran families of color report, where we really looked at experiences of military and veteran families of color by region and looking at those who are in the South and those who are in the West. What we find there is two challenges for that approach. One, regions are not always monolithic. Like if you look at the South includes Texas and Virginia and Florida, and those are three very different places with very different experiences. So it can be challenging to group all of that into one group because experiences vary. So the other challenge with that approach is, although we are a worldwide survey really, and we have responses from everywhere, all over the world, OCONUS, and in the United States, when we start breaking it down into subgroups and subgroups and subgroups, like if we're only looking at just active duty service members or just active duty families in this region or in this state, the sample sizes get really small. And it becomes to the point where it's irresponsible to report it because it's such a small sample that we can't say anything with much confidence that it's going to be accurate for others in that area. So, but that said, when we do have enough data, when the sample sizes are big enough to make comparisons, we can look at some of those things, not necessarily in the MFLS research, but in some of the other research that we've done, thinking particularly of a pulse check that we did last year in September on relocation and housing issues, where we were able to look at how much our relocation costs in the West, in this state, how much our relocation costs in another state. So yes, when we can, when it makes sense to do so, and when grouping by region or by state is not irresponsible to do. Okay. Are you able to discern the disability status, if any, of the respondents relative to whether or not they would encourage military service? Ooh, that is a good question. I did not think about that question, but that is the beauty of the data set that we collect, that we can sometimes explore questions that come up that did not occur at the time that we were doing the analysis. So I do know that we have in this year's data set the disability status of veteran respondents, and we also have whether or not they would encourage military service. So we have not looked at that, but it is an interesting thing to consider. Let me open it up to Dr. Harvey over at IBMF and see if you do or do not, that's fine if you don't, but if you have any words to add to that.
Hello. This year, we did not look at that specific dynamic, but it is, I think, a possibility that we could consider for future years.
Thanks. And that is the value, that is one of the values of doing these deep dives, is not only do I get to share this data with you and that I'm so excited to share, but also we can hear about ideas that we didn't think about, different analyses that we have. We have the capability to do with the data set, the data we've collected, but we just haven't had the time or the bandwidth to do. So let me see what other questions we have in the chat that I can respond to. how do you use feedback from the survey data to formulate policy recommendations? And what are policy recommendations for 2023? I love this question because policy and data drive one another. And that is, we sort of look at them as two wings of the same bird. We're going in the same direction and we need both to move it forward. So our research helps to inform policy, but then we look at how the policy, what are the policy implications of the research questions that we're asking? So that's another thing to think about as we're putting together the survey instrument is how can we word this in a way, how can we explore this data in a way that will be helpful for moving policy forward? So making sure it's usable data points that we develop from it. So we take the survey, it's a cyclical pattern. We take the survey data that we got and we say, all right, what are the implications of this? We found that this is higher in this group, lower in this group. This is more of a problem than we expected it to be. How can we take this data and use it to formulate recommendations? So we know that BAH is not enough. According to survey respondents, most are spending well over what they their anticipated cost share to pay for housing out of pocket. So 81% of those who have some out of pocket costs are spending more than $200 a month over their BAH. They're anticipated to spend $74 to $168 a month. So we know that out of pocket housing costs is an issue. We saw it's a top issue this year. So we take that and look at what are the policy efforts that are going on to address BAH. We know a few years ago, BAH was dropped slow incrementally down to 95% of the local market rate. So there's an anticipated 5% cost share. If we know that that 5%, people are spending well over that 5% cost share, maybe we then recommend that we go back up to restoring BAH to 100%. So, and then we of course go and we do all of these things in partnership with others. So we want to go and talk to policymakers and others who are doing this kind of work to see, is this a legitimate recommendation? Is this a recommendation that's possible? Is this the person who is in charge of this thing? So each of those recommendations is reviewed and vetted and made sure, and we make sure that it makes sense to address this particular issue. And then when we look at those policy issues that are coming up and the recommendations and the initiatives that are going on, then we use those to develop next year's survey. We say, you know, we know that housing a few years ago in this survey we looked at, we know what housing is an issue. How do we ask the question in a way that helps us address how much over BAH people are spending so that we can use that data point to help drive home this point? So that's kind of how we look at both of those things. BSF's policy recommendations for 2023 are not quite out yet. I did, sharing a little bit, I did just get a draft of what they look like today. So those will hopefully be out shortly so that we can share what those policy recommendations are. And it's challenging because there's a lot. MFLS covers a lot of topics, and there are a lot of pieces of military life that are, esoteric little pieces at a time. So we have to choose, we have to select of all of these things that could help military families. What are the things that we want to prioritize and focus on this year? That said, we do have recommendations chapter in this year's report, and there are recommendations at the end of every finding that are driven by what we found in that information. So I know that our policy team is also answering some of those questions, so I'll let them talk a little bit more about that. There is one question in the chat on racial equity in the demographic data. What I think this means, and I'm going to try and interpret it, but please address in the chat if I take this the wrong way. But racial equity in the demographic data, since we started our racial equity initiative, now called the Campaign for Inclusion, a couple of years ago, we really wanted to take a deep dive into looking at the demographics of our data, and particularly the racial and ethnic breakdown of our data points. And we know that it is not quite representative of the military population as a whole. Our sample in general is not quite representative of the military population as a whole. It varies in a lot of important ways. We have more spouses than we have service members. We have more mid-grade enlisted. We have the biggest group of our respondents represents ranks E5 to E7. Obviously, that's not the entire military. And the second biggest group of Second biggest group that is represented at 27% is 04 to 06. So we have a lot of mid-grade families, which makes sense when we have a family lifestyle survey. So we know it's not representative as a whole, but one of the things that we're looking at is what is the racial and ethnic breakdown of our population, and how does it differ from the racial and ethnic breakdown of the military population as a whole? It can be challenging to do that because, as we noted in our Diverse Experiences Military Families report, Military and Veteran Families of Color report, there's not a good, clear understanding of how many military family members are people of color and what their racial and ethnic breakdown is. We're getting closer to that, but we're not there yet. So we tend to use the service members' racial and ethnic identities as a proxy, but we recognize that that's not perfect because almost a quarter of our military families are members of multiracial, multi-ethnic families. So the service member may be one race or ethnicity and the family members are different. So we can't use it as a proxy. Long story short, what we see is that we still fall a little short of what those racial and ethnic proportions are in the active duty population. So we have a smaller group of Black respondents and a smaller group of Hispanic respondents than we would like to have, but we continue to work on building that population to make sure it's as representative as we can get it to be. So it's a continual work in progress. All right, let me look here for some other questions. Thank you for all these wonderful questions. I appreciate the opportunity for feedback and the opportunity to share this work that we've been doing for a year and bringing to share with you today. Whew, I have a lot of questions. I'm scrolling down to get to all the ones. What is the last one that I see is what is the number on SNAP? So SNAP are food stamp benefits, and that is one area that is particularly challenging and that is of interest for military families because military families are one of the pieces of income that's included in calculation for SNAP benefits is the basic allowance for housing. And that's been an issue that we have made recommendations on before on excluding that basic allowance for housing, because if you live in military housing, you actually don't see a penny of that housing allowance. It just goes directly to the housing company. So you don't actually see that in your budget. You can't reallocate it to food should you want to. And it's also a disparity with other benefit programs that do not include vouchers or housing allowances in their calculation of income. So essentially, what we find is military families don't often qualify for food stamp benefits because their income, when you include BAH, looks too high to be included. So we do ask about whether respondents have participated in SNAP during the 12 months prior to survey fielding. We have asked that a few times over the course of the previous few years. I don't have those numbers in front of me, but I think we could share those if we have them. Again, this might be one of those that the sample is too small to share reliably, but I do know that the numbers are often very small. It is 1%. My team reached out to me and 1% of people, of our respondents, have participated in SNAP benefits in the year before. Active duty family respondents. Thank you for that correction. All right, what other questions do we have? There is a lot. When the results come in and are placed into categories, are the results shared with those in higher command? Do you follow up with higher command to see if changes are being implemented based on the needs that the results yield? So, long story short, yes, absolutely we share these with higher ups, both not only in DoD, but also with legislative leaders and also with community leaders at all different levels. That is the point of what we are trying to do here. We are trying to pull information and elevate military families' voices to the people who make decisions, so that to the people who are in charge of policies and programs and practices that impact military families' lives. So of course we share them broadly, and we share them each year whenever we come up, not even just each year when we publish the MFLS, but also when we publish other reports, because we have the MFLS and then we do other research in addition to. So we share those and brief them to legislative leaders, DoD leaders, community leaders, all kinds of people that have the ability to inform change. In terms of following up, I think that's what we mean when we do an annual survey. We check in on these issues year over year and again share them. So we make recommendations to different stakeholders on what we think would help given the information that we have and the data that we've collected. But we don't necessarily follow up individually with individual people. Did you do this particular thing? Because we recognize we are one voice of many, many voices that are influencing policy. There are lots of things at play here. So thank you for those questions. That's why we do this survey year over year, so that we can continue to inform and follow up with the recommendations that we made and the data that we find. The decoding of responses, I'm just grabbing a few questions that I see highlighted here. Did your coding of responses include geographical demographics or branch of service? Yes, absolutely. Some of those demographics are key to look at subpopulations. So we always include demographics like branch of service, as well as your relationship to the military service, whether you are a spouse or a service member, or maybe both, or a veteran or the spouse of a veteran, and so on. So we gather those demographics. We also gather geographic demographics. So some of those are, what state do you live in? What country do you live in if you live OCONUS? And we also ask about, sometimes we ask about zip code as well. Any questions that we ask, though, are optional. Outside of some questions that are required to determine branching, most of the questions are possible to skip. So we don't always gather all the information. We don't always have all the information on things like zip code. Many people will skip that question, so we don't always have it. That is also why throughout the course of the survey, you will see the number of respondents for different questions will vary. So we had 9,363 people start the survey, and those people include veterans and spouses of veterans and active duty and National Guard and Reserve. And for each of those groups, some questions may not be applicable. So they will skip over different sections. If you don't have children, we're not going to ask you questions about children. So the sample sizes will change for each question because of those things. Some questions don't apply, some questions you just don't want to answer, so you skip over it. That's why that sample size will change. We also have, all of this is detailed in our methodology section of the report. Happy to answer questions about that as well. Ooh, for key topics that you take to policymakers, does BSF provide pre-written recommendation letters that can be sent? Ooh, good question. That can be sent to these legislative members within their respective jurisdiction states. So when we take key topics to policymakers, we do provide recommendations. We typically do not provide pre-written recommendation letters that can be sent to those legislative members within respective jurisdictions and states, simply because we have a small policy team and we have a lot of work to do in addition to that. So we don't always do those pre-written letters because we don't have as many people as we would like to do those things, but we do provide those recommendations in the report itself. It looks like Elizabeth asked, is there a way to look at food? Oh, hang on, I lost it. Is there a way to look at food insecurity, spouse employment, and retention in Hawaii in response to the water crisis paired with the Hawaii OCONUS COLA decrease? So one of the benefits of the variety of data that we collect in this survey is that we have a lot of data points that we can cross with one another and see how these variables influence one another. Unfortunately, though, as I said, when we get into smaller and smaller sample sizes, like if we only look at active duty families that are in Hawaii, that's a much smaller group of people. And then when we look at spouse employment, not every spouse is in the workforce. So when we look at spouse unemployment, that sample goes even smaller. And then we look at things like exposures to toxic exposures. Again, the sample gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's really hard to piece out, is is any decrease in willingness to recommend service, is that tied to the water crisis, or is it tied to the pending COLA decrease, or is it tied to the spouse unemployment? So it's really hard to disentangle those things and figure out what exactly is it. We know it's several different things, I'm sure, but is it this thing or that thing? So that is one of the challenges with survey methodology, is we don't, and especially an annual survey methodology, is we are looking at larger patterns to identify. Going back to the title of our release this year, Signal in the Field, what we were attempting to do is illuminate issues that can be explored further. We don't always have pinpoint what the answer is, but we can say, we know some of these things are the things that make a difference. Another question from the chat is, do we ever survey children in military families or adult children of military families? Also a really good question. I'm glad it was this came up. We don't survey children. And one of the reasons that we don't survey children, everybody has to be over 18, is because there are a lot of ethical restrictions around surveying and doing research on children. Our research is sponsored, maybe not the right word, overseen by the Institutional Review Board at Syracuse University, which means that we are paying very close attention to ethics and those ethical considerations that happen in human subjects research. So because there are a lot of, when we work with children are a vulnerable population, any research on children has to include a lot of different regulations in order to protect those children. And that's one reason that our survey methodology is not set up to survey children, because we don't have the ability to do some of the things that we would need to do to ethically survey military children in the way that we do our survey methodology. What we can do and what we have done is survey adult children in military families. When you enter the survey, you have the ability to answer questions about your relationship, your military affiliation. And because we know many people who are connected to military service are connected in multiple ways, they might be a service member, they're also the child of a service member, they're also a parent of a service member. So there's multi-generational respondents who are who are answering the survey. So we do have an option, the ability to pull out people who are adult children of service members, so we can see. Now, that population that we have in this survey is again kind of small, because it's focused on active duty families. We don't have as many respondents who are just the child of adult child of a service member or of a veteran. So again, small sample sizes mean we can't do as much with the data, we can't reliably report on it and make decisions based on it. Also, we haven't really dug into that, because the policy implications for adult children are very different from the policy implications that we can make for active duty families. So if we see that BAH is an issue now, or mental health, that might be a better example. If we look at mental health access as an issue for military families now, we have some policy recommendations we can make as a result of that, and say, these are the things that might help access mental health for active duty families. If we understand that if we survey adult children of military families and we see that mental health is also an issue for them, it's good to know what policy recommendation do we make from that. There is not one single entity that is in charge of looking at adult children of military families. So it becomes a little bit harder to make targeted recommendations that will move change. That's a great question, though. I appreciate that opportunity to answer that. Oh, this chat is flying. Look at you all. So many questions. Oh, yes. Okay. So can we share where the most responses come from geographically? Yes. And in fact, we do that in the methodology section of the report. And when we break it down by state and say, this percentage of respondents come from here and here and here and here. I think one of the highest places the most common places that the states that have the highest response rate here are like Virginia and California, places that you would expect because there's a big military population. But there is definitely more on that in the methodology section of the report. Oh, out of curiosity. Oh, I think I answered this a little bit further, but let me reiterate on it. Out of curiosity, who decides what questions should go on the survey? Is there a group or board that comes up with the questions, and is the group or board a diverse group to include people of color? Great question. The questions that go into the survey are decided by our team in conjunction with a lot of other influence. So it's not done by board because that takes a long time to get board to agree on a group of questions. And there are so many questions, and it goes annually. So we have to do that. We do this year over year over year. So the group, it's not a group or a board. It's determined by our applied research team in partnership with the Daniello Institute for Veterans and Military Families, who we have been partnering with for many years now. But it is informed and influenced by a lot of other policymakers, stakeholders, people who have expertise in particular areas. We often consult with and bring in feedback from subject matter experts, particularly because we can't be the experts in all the things. So we want to bring in somebody who's an expert on children's education or children's mental health or mental health in general. All of those things, we bring that information to inform the questions. We do have some diversity in the group of people who work on the survey. We also definitely have a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion when we are looking at these questions and ensuring that we are trying to be as inclusive as possible and understanding the variety of experiences that many different military families have. Thank you for that question. Ooh, okay, another question from the chat. Is there a way to break out particular regions or areas with smaller surveys to target more specific topics? So yes, and we kind of do that in some ways already. When we look at, we haven't done that as much with particular regions, like geographic regions, but we have done that with a branched smaller survey on particular topics. So we may ask questions about some area that is, family building is the example that comes to mind from last year's report. We wanted to find out more about family building. Family building doesn't apply to everybody who takes the survey. Not everybody is, that's just not a part of everybody's life experience. So we ask a branching question and say, is this experience relevant to you in a much better way than I just said it? And then we can pull out the people who are affected by that experience and ask more targeted questions. So children might be another good example. We only ask questions about children and children's experiences to those who have children. And we only ask questions about military children's education for those who have children who are K-12 age or in K-12 education, because that way we can learn more about that particular topic without asking it to everybody. Great question. All right, I think we have time for one more question before we start to close it up a little bit. Looks like there's a question about crosstab analyses. We actually do a lot of crosstab analyses in the report. We don't report out every single crosstab because there's a lot of questions and a lot of demographics that we could crosstab on, but many of our analyses in the findings of the report are done by crosstab. So we look at, an example might be looking at the recommending service finding, where we look at what was the recommendation for female service members, what was the recommendation for male service members, female veterans, male veterans, and so on. And we look at those to do some analyses and compare. So there's a lot of crosstabs, they're just not listed out as such. Happy to answer further questions about particular crosstabs if you want to share it with me afterwards. So I think that was the last question for today. What I'm going to do it now, this hour has flown by. You guys have asked and answered tons of questions in the chat. I love to see this level of engagement and finding out, seeing how interested you all are in the report that we have. Please keep sharing questions with us. I think we can add our research at bluestarfam.org into the chat here, and you can continue to ask those questions. Also, please be sure to join us at our next deep dive session that starts at 3 p.m. Eastern, and we can see you guys then. I'll leave this open for a little bit and we'll pull in the rest of your questions. Thank you so much for joining us today.